Hello, this is Paul Connett. This was meant to be the beginning of a month's tour of Australia, and I'm a retired professor of chemistry, and I specialized in environmental chemistry and toxicology. So I've spent the last 24 years pursuing this matter, and when I first got involved in 1996, it coincided with two important events. One, in 1995, just 1 year before, Phyllis Mullinex at the Forsyth Dental Center in Boston produced an animal study which showed that animals exposed to fluoride before they were born were hyperactive, and animals exposed after they were born were hyperactive. She applied a new technique with video cameras and computers analyzing the movements of the animals side by side, those exposed, those non-exposed, and a novel technique. And Forsyth wanted her to look at the neurological impacts of the chemicals that they used in dentistry. And the first one she looked at was fluoride, and to her surprise, she wasn't expecting to find anything, but sure enough, the behavior of these animals was changed by exposure to fluoride. Rather than celebrating this important work, the Forsyth Dental Center fired her, told her that her work was no longer relevant to dentistry. Extraordinary. And poor Phyllis has not been employed in academia since. And you can imagine the terrible shockwave that went through the circles of scientific researchers. They were essentially being told, don't look at fluoride, because if you find the wrong thing, you could lose your job, you could lose your funding, etc., etc., etc. That, thank goodness, is now changing, but more about that later. And then in 1996, in 95 and 96, we got the first two IQ studies from China published in English. Subsequently, we found that there were other studies published before then, going back to 1989. But these were the first two that were available in English. And that was very, very important. And I was very struck at the time that why on earth, if fluoride could potentially lower the IQ of children, how could that notion be subservient to the notion that you need children exposed to fluoride to lower a little bit of tooth decay? But we're still in the history here. Now, catching up to the present, as of 2020, there have now been 72 fluoride IQ studies, and 64 of these have found a lowered IQ associated with higher fluoride exposure, and only 8 that have not found this association, or at least not a statistically significant association. Some other studies found an association, but it wasn't statistically significant. But an overwhelming preponderance of studies have had this, seen this effect where they've looked at it. The problem has been that people have not been looking at this in the fluoridated countries like the United States, Canada, England, Ireland, New Zealand, and Australia. But more recently, the studies have been done in Canada, and there is one study in New Zealand which we will talk about. So on our webpage, fluoridealert.org, you will find a summary of the 60, actually it's 64, you can hardly keep up with the number of studies, 64. And my wife has gone through these 64 studies and described each study, linked to each study, made the whole study available where copyright allows. So you'll find that very useful. This is a gold mine of information on our website. I think we have the largest health database on fluoride in the world. And you have to ask the question, why is a citizens group, a non-profit organization, making available all this literature when governments are not doing it? That's a serious question that somebody in public health should be answering. Now, here are the key papers that I want to talk about. Some historical, but some very much in the last 3 years. So the first study I should be talking about is the Chiang Study. The next study we should be talking about is a review of 27 IQ studies by a team, reviewed by a team from Harvard. It was a meta-analysis, and that included Philip Grandjean, who's a world-renowned specialist in mercury toxicology, neurotoxicology. Then the Bombshell. This is the pivotal moment in the history of this issue. This was the study done in 2017 in Mexico City by Bashash and co-workers. That changed history of this whole debate. This study is the beginning of the end of fluoridation, or at least from a scientific point of view. Obviously, we can see the politics trying to keep this practice alive. More about that later. The next very important paper is 2019, which is essentially a replication of the Bashash study. These are both mother-offspring study, finding a relationship with between the exposure of the mother to fluoride and the lowered IQ of her offspring. So this is the first time, essentially, that we have seen the most sensitive life period is the fetal stage. It's the fetal stage which is, the fetus is the most sensitive to fluoride's neurotoxicity, which is very serious. Then we have another study in 2020, again from Canada, and this deals with bottle feeding, how you can see a difference in the IQ of children between children who are bottle fed in a fluoridated community in Canada and children who are bottle fed in a non-fluoridated community. Another bombshell study. When the National Research Council produced this 500-page review of fluoride's toxicology. It was the most balanced review that's ever been done on fluoride. I had the privilege of being the only anti-fluoride scientist to give testimony to them, and they incorporated much of my testimony in their review. So that too was a big moment for us. But again, unfortunately, winning scientifically does not mean you win politically. And one of those studies was this study by Quanyang Zhang. Now, I want you to see how the National Health and Medical Research Council, which is a federal agency, part of the federal government, this is what they did with Zhang. I want you to look at this, absorb it, because then I want to show you the significance of the paper. They said full paper excluded, wrong intervention, no low or optimal fluoride group. Final status, excluded. Now when this NHMRC report came out, there were two volumes. The first volume was the narrative, and the second volume was all the studies that they excluded, which was thicker than the first one. But this was one that was excluded, which annoyed me enormously. Another thing which was annoying, this study came out in 2007. This is 1 year after the NRC had spent 3.5 years doing this excellent review of all the toxicology. They handled that with one sentence. They just said this sentence. They said, in addition to the study, there have been other studies. They referred to a World Health Organization pamphlet, and they referred to this study, the NRC, and they said, however, the levels at which they were concerned was 2 to 4 parts per million, and in Australia we fluoridate at much lower levels. And that was it. They didn't take advantage of anything in that report. Really poor. And especially it betrayed a lack of toxicological understanding. For the sake of argument, supposing a study at 4 parts per million had found harm, and you were fluoridating at 1 part per million, there is no adequate margin of safety to allow you to ignore that 4 parts per million, for a variety of reasons. And one reason is that concentration is not the same as dose. So someone consuming a lot of water at 1 part per million could easily get a higher dose than someone consuming a little water, 4 parts per million. So you can't dismiss this as a study based upon concentration. However, let's go on. Now let's look at the Chiang Study then. They compared the IQ of children in 2 villages. I visited those villages. The low fluoride village, where the average was 0.36 parts per million, the range was 0.18 to 0.76. How can the NHMRC, they'll say there was no control, there was no low or normal community. That overlaps with 0.7. We use 0.7 in Canada and the United States. I think you're 0.85. And the high fluoride village was 2.5 parts per million. Again, the range overlaps the levels used in Australia. They control for lead exposure and iodine intake, both of which can interfere with mental development. You have to exclude those. And arsenic. They found a drop of 5 to 10 IQ points across the whole age range between the 2 villages. And you can see how systematically the IQ curves were shifted down, so that if you look to the right here, you've got fewer people with high IQs. You see that on the right? You're looking at IQs 120, 130. The 130 is very bright kids. Fewer in that category. And over here, you've got more children. The magenta curve is the high fluoride village. More children who are less than 70 mentally handicapped. That shift is very important. We'll come back to that shift later on. But they did something even more important. The Waimeo was the high fluoride village. And notice they subdivided that into 5 groups with different fluoride concentrations in their water. 0.75, 1.5, 2.5, 3.3, 4 point something. And then over here is the average IQ in all those groups as you go up. And you see it starts with there's hardly much difference between them and the low fluoride village. But as you increase the water concentrations, the average IQ drops as you go down. And then they did something else. Oh, there's the curve. You plot this curve. So looking at this curve, excluding anything else, you would say IQ would be lowered in this experiment somewhere between 0.75 and 1.5. So this is saying that the IQ is lowered at the levels at which you fluoridate in Australia, and yet this has been excluded by the NHMRC. Now they did a second thing. They looked at the percentage of children in each of these groups who had an IQ less than 80. IQ of 80 to 70 means borderline mentally handicapped. Less than 70 is mentally handicapped. So the fraction in this group is very significant. Look how it rises. In this group, 9.5%, 14%, 21%, 37% of the children have been shifted into this mentally handicapped area. And again, you can plot this out. The higher the fluoride concentration in the water, the higher the fraction of children who are in the mentally handicapped area. Now, by 2010, the number of studies has gone up to 23 IQ studies. Again, China, India, Iran, and Mexico. And we had increased that number because we translated many of the Chinese studies that hadn't been available. That's why the number gets jacked up here. And in our book, this book, I wrote with 2 other professors, we have 80 pages of references in here, including all the references to all the IQ studies, these 23 studies. Okay. Now, the next turning point is 2012, where this issue goes beyond fluoride activists and Chinese researchers. This is when a team from Harvard, including Philippe Grandjean, published a meta-analysis of 27 of these IQ studies, many, incidentally, of the ones that we had translated from Chinese. And these included 25 studies from China and 2 from Iran. And it was published in Environmental Health Perspectives, which is one of the leading environmental health journals in the world. It is the House Journal of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, which is the research body for the National Institute of Health, which promotes fluoridation. So this, within the system, we have this major publication, this review. Now what they found is that there were weaknesses in many of these studies. They didn't have all the information that they needed. All the confounders, were the confounders controlled? However, what they said is the results were remarkably consistent. Out of the 27 studies, 26 of them showed a lowering of IQ. And considering that these, with the average lowering, by the way, average lowering was 7 IQ points, which is significant. Now, highly significant from a social point of view. Considering that these studies were done over a period of 20 years, done by different research teams from different universities in different geographical locations in China, to get a consistency like that is quite extraordinary, which the authors acknowledged. And they said there was not an obvious confounding variable that they could see that could possibly explain such a consistency. Here are all the 20 studies. Here are all the 20 studies. You can see they go from 1991, I think it is, all the way down to wherever, 20 years worth. And if you take all the average of all those studies, there's this figure down here is minus 0.45. What is that? It's half a standard deviation. The difference in IQ is half a standard deviation. The proponents of fluoridation ran around saying, oh, it was only half an IQ point. It wasn't half an IQ point, it was half a standard deviation, which translates to 7 IQ points. There's a big difference between half an IQ point and 7 IQ points. Again, a little bit of, maybe it's an accident, but a little bit of politics may be coming in there. And then this included, by the way, there it is, there's Zhang over there. We've talked about that already. All right. Now, confronted with this body of evidence, whilst it's causing ripple effect amongst activists around the world, the proponents of fluoridation have focused on one study to negate all these studies. And that is a study done in New Zealand by Broadbent in 2014. So let's have a look at that study. It's fatally flawed, in my view. There were very few controls. There were 991 of the kids in this study lived in a fluoridated area when they were growing up, and only 99 in non-fluoridated. Moreover, Broadbent only looked at the exposure from fluoridated water and ignored the possible and probable exposure from other things like supplements. Most of the kids in New Zealand that weren't on fluoridated water at that time were given supplements. So by the time you subtract those kids, there's very little difference in the fluoride intake between the two groups. And so the study lacked any power. Further complicating this is that New Zealand is one of the biggest tea drinkers at that time in the world. And tea is a big source of fluoride. So if you're concerned about this issue, don't drink so much tea here. Okay. Mix it. Have coffee, chamomile, all those other things. Herbal teas. Okay. Now we could argue about the quality of this study, and people have. The NHMRC, however, I thought it was a poor study. But this is now 2017, okay? Basically in 2017 they regurgitated the 2007 study, and here's the details. This was published in July of 2017. 2017, important year, July. And what did they say? Well, they only referenced 15 now of the 50 IQ studies. They didn't refer to the Harvard meta-analysis. Again, they ignored Zhang of 2003, even though people like myself wrote a stinging critique of the NHMRC 2000 study. And they gave Broadbent a high-quality rating and a low risk of bias. And this was key to their conclusion. Their conclusion, the evidence from a single study of acceptable quality, meaning broadband, shows that there is no association between water fluoridation at current Australian levels and the cognitive function of children or adults. Well, that's so that you know they are putting the weight on the study, which I consider is a lousy study, and I don't know, and I haven't got it here. But later on, when the NTP review came out, they reviewed all the studies and they gave broadband a low quality study, a high risk of bias to their study. So they agree with us. Anyway, this is all moot because on September the 19th, and it's all moot in terms of using broadband to negate all the Chinese etc. studies, because on the 19th of September came the Bombshell, and the Bombshell was Bashash 2017. Again, this was published in Environmental Health Perspectives. It was a prenatal study, one of the first to look at the fetus exposed to fluoride as opposed to the child. I mean, right up to this point, when we see a lowered IQ of the children, we don't know if it's IQ being lowered whilst they were infants, bottle feeding, or whether it's IQ lowered during pregnancy, when they're in the womb. We didn't know. This is the first time that anybody had set out to look at that. So it's a 12-year study. It's a multi-million-dollar study, and it's funded by US government agencies, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Institute of Health, and the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. Important. The authors came from many prestigious institutions: University of Toronto, University of McGill, Harvard, Indiana, Michigan, Mount Sinai, and a Mexican institute. What did they do? They examined approximately 300 mother-offspring pairs. So you measure something in the mother and you measure something in the offspring, and they're linked, they're pairs of data. Both exposure and outcomes were determined on an individual basis. All the studies before this point had been measuring communities, the level of community in the fluoride, the level in the water of the group, and the level of the water of the control. Comparing communities. These are called ecological studies, and they are the lowest weight from epidemiological point of view. What we have here are individual-based measurements. And the mother's exposure to fluoride during pregnancy was determined via their urine levels. Now that's incredibly important because there are many sources of fluoride out there. Tea, water if you're fluoridated or if it's natural, food, some foods are high in fluoride, any food with bones in it is going to be high in fluoride, and fluoridated water, fluoridated salt is used in Mexico. This study was done in Mexico City. But the level of fluoride in the urine gives you a total measure of the woman's exposure to fluoride. So it doesn't matter if she got the fluoride from water or from toothpaste or anything else. Total exposure. That's our measurement of one data point.
How does it come out in the urine? Is it like calcium fluoride, or is it something?
It's fluoride ion. Once the fluoride is in water, anything like calcium fluoride, sodium fluoride is irrelevant, because in water an ionic substance splits up into the separate ions. Positive. They don't know each other. It's just like, say you've got sodium chloride, salt. As far as the chemist is concerned, a solution of sodium chloride is two chemicals. You've got sodium ions free in water and chloride ions in free water. Totally separate chemistries. You can study them separately, you can test for them separately. And the sodium ions and sodium chloride will be identical to the sodium ions and sodium fluoride. So yes, what you measure in the urine is free fluoride ions with a fluoride sensitive electrode. Notice they controlled for all the variables that the Chinese studies were criticized for not controlling for all these variables. It's extremely difficult in epidemiology to get two communities which are similar in every characteristic. It's very difficult. So you have to control for these different things so that you really are looking at the one thing that you're examining, which in this case is fluoride and the outcome. Okay. Now, they looked at the IQ of these women's offspring at the age of 4 and again at 6 to 12. And what they found is that for every 1 milligram per litre increase in the concentration in the woman's urine, there was a 5 to 6 IQ point drop in those offspring matched pairs. You'll see the significance of that in a moment. Well, here we are. Now, see the bottom? That is the maternal urine fluoride, the level of fluoride in the mother's urine. And that blue area, that blue bracket, is the range of mother's urine levels in the United States. That's the range. Over here, the red bracket, if you go across to the curve, shows you what the IQ drop. And that's the 5 to 6 IQ point drop. In other words, for the expected range in the United States, the IQ drop would be 5 to 6 IQ points. So what we're looking at here is a top-class study looking at effects which correspond to what we're exposed to in the United States. Now they criticize. Oh, well, you'll see the criticism in a moment. This is their conclusion. In this study, higher levels of maternal urinary fluoride during pregnancy, a proxy for prenatal fluoride exposure, that are in the range of levels of exposure in other general population samples of pregnant women, as well as non-pregnant adults, were associated with the lower scores on tests of cognitive function in the offspring at 4 and 6 to 12 years of age. Devastating study. Got very little media attention. And this is what the American Dental Association said in an interview 1 minute after it was published. In other words, they were ready with their press release. They'd obviously got a pre-copy, so they're ready with their press release. And when the journalist goes out to get comments from them, they're ready with it. And here's the comment from the American Dental Association. The American Dental Association examined a study in environmental health perspectives based on fluoride intake in Mexico and concludes the findings are not applicable to the United States. The ADA continues to endorse fluoridation of public water as the most effective public health measure to prevent tooth decay. We've seen statements like that coming out from the ADA for the past 50 years. It doesn't matter what the study is, it's always the same. This is what the author, the prime author, the guy that heads up the study of this particular cohort, which has been investigated for over 20 years, Howard Hugh, remember that name. Many of the experts here are going to be working for us or testifying in our court case. He's one of them. Okay. He said he was interviewed in the same article in the Toronto newspaper. This is a very rigorous epidemiological study. You just can't deny it. It's directly related to whether fluoride is a risk to the neurodevelopment of children. To say it has no relevance to the folks in the United States seems disingenuous. How gentle scientists can be. Okay, so I could tell you about a study that was done within a few months in Canada which showed that the average level in the urine of pregnant women in fluoridated communities in Canada was almost identical to the level in the Mexico City study. So within a few months, that ADA conclusion was thrown out. But more importantly, the Bombshell study was essentially replicated with one significant difference in Canada. This is a study by Green and co-workers, and it was published in one of the world's leading journals of pediatrics, JAMA Pediatrics. As I said, they essentially reproduce the same methodology, the association between mother's urine levels during pregnancy and IQ scores in the offspring. If anything, their methodology was stronger. They learned from some of the criticisms of Bombshell to do it even better. What did they find? Oh, again, this was funded by the NIH, government agency, US. They found a large statistically significant effects on IQ, but the average loss of IQ, as far as the maternal exposure was concerned, was only in boys, not girls. Now, the authors offered some explanation of why that might have been, But nevertheless, the pro-fluoridation people have latched onto the fact that it was only boys to try to discredit the whole studies. But meanwhile, the authors not only looked at a relationship between maternal exposure, your mother's urine level, but they looked at the exposure of the mother in the communities where they were living. So they looked at mother's ingestion, the total fluoride, this graph here, the total fluoride intake in milligrams per day. And with that measurement, they found a drop of IQ for both the boys and the girls. And it's possible, I'm not saying this is sure, but it's possible that boys are more sensitive in the womb, but girls are sensitive once they're born. Well, that's yet to be resolved. And JAMA Pediatrics, this important article was refused by other journals because it was too controversial. And JAMA, knowing how controversial this would be, they doubled up the amount of peer review. They had people go through the statistical analysis twice just to make sure that they hadn't made any obvious mistakes. And in addition, when they published it, they published a short editorial explaining the steps they took to make sure this was peer-reviewed properly. They carried an article by David Bellinger, one of the world's experts on lead neurotoxicity, and they put out a podcast of the editor of JAMA's Total and the editor of JAMA Pediatrics talking about this study. If I had more time, I could show you excerpts of this, but you can go to our webpage and listen to it. Basically what they're saying, boy, I thought that fluoridation was one of the best things since sliced bread. That's what I was always told. It was perfectly safe. But look at this. And they're shocked. They're obviously shocked. And one of the conclusions is they advised pregnant women. They said, one of them said, if my wife was pregnant, I'd advise her not to drink fluoridated water. Now, unlike Bashash, this received massive public media attention. Not the New York Times, they've yet to cover it, but massive media attention around the world. JAMA Pediatrics distributed the study widely, and unfortunately that meant that the pro-fluoridation people had time to round up a number of experts to attack this paper. We have since shown that most of their criticism, if not all their criticisms, do not hold water. One of the big criticisms, this is only one study. Only one study? This is ridiculous. I've told you how many studies there are. And so on. Anyway, we've got Andrew has prepared a summary of all the responses to those critiques if this becomes an issue in any of your discussions with others. Before I go further, I want to explain the huge significance of the loss of IQ at the population level, not at the individual level. It could be critical for some individuals, depending upon where they are on this curve. But for the population, it is critical. And I'd like to explain it with this diagram. That is a normal distribution curve, the famous bell-shaped curve. IQ is in the bottom axis, and the area under the curve represents the number of children with a particular IQ value. So, with that said, the two areas under the curve which are particularly significant, I'd already referred to this when I talked about Chiang. Those above 130, and the area under the curve is that green area represents the fraction of children in your population who are very bright. It would include geniuses, that green area. And that magenta area is IQ less than 70. Those are all the mentally handicapped. Now, if you were to shift the curve down by 5 IQ points, or thereabouts, this is what happens. The average person goes from 100 to 95, and a parent wouldn't notice. If a parent had two siblings and you had an IQ of 100 and you had 95, your parent wouldn't know it. The school teacher wouldn't be able to spot it. But look what happens to the two tails here. Look what happens to the very bright. you have halved the number of very bright kids in your society. Huge economic ramifications in this global economy. And look over here, you've increased, the exact number is you've increased by 57% the number of intellectually impaired. Again, that has huge social and economic implications. So what you do to your population is very, very serious. And this is a measure which is designed to reach the whole population of your children, the whole population. This isn't like any medicine where it only impacts a few people that might be critically ill and they need something to cure cancer. Then you take risks. But here is a risk that you're imposing on the whole population. Okay, another bombshell. 2020, just a few months ago, Christine Teal, Canadian researcher, and this is what they found. They looked at the difference in IQ of children who had been bottle fed in fluoridated communities compared to children who were bottle fed in non-fluoridated communities in Canada. The only difference was that all the kids were bottle fed. One had, the parents were using tap water, fluoridated tap water to make up the formula, and non-fluoridated tap water. You wouldn't, you know, what kind of IQ drop would you expect? My God. 9 IQ points on the full scale IQ for each 1 milligram per litre increase in tap water. 9 IQ points. And then if you look at performance scale IQ, which is non-verbal, it's called performance scale, non-verbal. 19 IQ. I mean, these numbers, most people would disbelieve that this study, and I'm sure they're trying now to destroy this study, but it's a bombshell. So now we've got evidence that in the womb, the brain is damaged, and now as an infant, it's damaged. And here's the recommendation from the authors. After adjusting for fetal exposure, they adjusted for fetal exposure. So now we're looking separate from fetal. We found that fluoride exposure during infancy predicts diminished nonverbal intelligence. In the absence of any benefit from fluoride consumption in the first 6 months, it is prudent to limit fluoride exposure by using non-fluoridated water or water with lower fluoride content as a formula. Needless to say, no agency in Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, or any fluoridated country has attempted to get this warning to parents about bottle feeding their kids. Meanwhile, they've not warned pregnant women that there's any problem. Now, this goes back to one of the first things I discovered when I was reading the literature in 1996, when my wife persuaded me to get involved in it. The level of fluoride in mother's milk is incredibly low. And I said at the time, my goodness, nature doesn't make many mistakes. If fluoride was necessary for baby's development, whether it's teeth, bones, or whatever, that's where you expect to find it. And you don't find it. It's very, very low. And so I argue that mother's milk protects the infant from fluoride. And when you fluoridate, you remove that protection. The level in if you bottle feed, it's between 175, well, it depends where you fluoridate. Supposing you fluoridate at 1 part per million, it's 250 times higher. So I've been saying that. You've heard my talk so many times. I've been saying this now for 20 odd years in my presentations. And now I'm talking to you just a couple of months after the study that we feared most has been published. That there's a dramatic difference on the IQ of the kids. Okay, so now look at ADHD, where the results are even more striking. A little bit of history. Back in 2015, Malin and Till, this is the same Till as the last paper, they did this study. They looked at the prevalence of ADHD by state in the United States, by state, the 50 states. And the indices that they measured was the percentage of the state fluoridated. So at the bottom you've got the order of the states in terms of how much of their water is fluoridated throughout the state. And look what happens to the prevalence of ADHD. They did this for 3 years worth of data. They did it for data from 2003, 2007, 2011. And what you find in each case is the prevalence of ADHD increases by state as the percentage of the state fluoridated increases. Well, that's again the proponents attack this study. Then Bashesh, remember Bashesh 2017 from Mexico State, the same cohort, they looked at attention deficit syndrome. So in addition to looking at IQ, they looked at ADHD. And sure enough, they found an increase in ADHD as the mother's exposure went up. Another good quality study. And then another bombshell, you ready? 2019, another Canadian study, another study funded by the NIH. What did they do? They looked at the prevalence of ADHD in fluoridated communities in Canada versus non-fluoridated. And they found nearly 3 times, 2.84 to be precise, but nearly 300% higher risk of ADHD for those living in fluoridated areas in Canada compared to non-fluoridated. And for each milligram per litre increase of fluoride in the tap water, a 600% increase in ADHD. It's hard. I mean, we were staggered by these results. We thought there would be, increases, but we had no idea it was as powerful as that. And what this underlines, incidentally, and the same thing is with the virus right now, the absence of study does not mean the absence of harm. So Trump says there's no problem with the virus, and we did a few weeks ago. I think he's changed his mind now. There's no problem. But what he didn't mention is there were hardly any tests being done for the virus in Canada a couple of weeks ago. And so you can't assume that the absence of study is the same as absence of harm. And that's what's been assumed in Australia since you started fluoridation in the 60s and 70s. You just haven't done the studies here. You haven't done a single IQ study in Australia. You haven't done a single ADHD study in Australia. You've hardly done any studies. And they just repeat, it's safe and effective, safe and effective, safe and effective. I think the conclusion is obvious. And then finally this paper by Malin until she found, using nationally available data, that adolescents had a higher problems with sleeping in the fluoridated, with higher levels of fluoride in their drinking water than lower levels. This relates to fluoride possibly because there have been animal studies which shows that lowered fluoride produces lowered melatonin production in animals, and lowered melatonin production obviously will affect sleep patterns. It's very little data, unfortunately, and there's been not much attempt to repeat the work done in England on that, particularly on the pineal gland. The NTP review in 2016, we at the Fluoride Action Network requested that the National Toxicology Program conduct a systematic review of fluoride's neurotoxicity. In today's world, you can have all these top-class studies, but unless someone has done a systematic review where they quantify the quality of each study and add it all up, it doesn't count. And that's the way NHMRC gets away with it. It's always they've done a systematic review, and all the harm that we thought was out there magically disappears. The draft came out late last year of this systematic review, after 3 years of work, and this was their conclusion. NTP concludes that fluoride is presumed, this is the second highest level of classification. The top one is a known neurotoxicant. Basically, it's a presumed. Based upon the studies that are out there, you can presume that it's a neurotoxicant. This conclusion is based upon a consistent pattern of findings in human studies across several different populations, showing that higher fluoride exposure is associated with decreased IQ or other cognitive impairments in children. Wow! We have finally been vindicated. After 24 years of concerns on this issue, we finally get the #1 agency in the United States for toxicology coming out and saying that. Short-lived. Oh, by the way, this is their Broadbent. They reviewed Broadbent. The orange areas indicate high risk of bias. Those three, and remember, NHMRC used Broadbent as the study which allowed them to say no problem. And now, March the 5th, just a few days ago, just before I came out here, I left on March the 7th, the National Academy of Sciences, a panel for the National Academy of Sciences, came out and said this NTP review has problems. They didn't follow their protocols, blah, 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 blah. They themselves analyzed the scientific review itself, the science itself, but just the way that the NTP quantified the quality of the different studies, etc. And they had more harsh things to say about the animal studies than the human studies. As far as we can tell, and we put out a press release on this, the substance of the NTP review has not been impacted. The substance is there, but what this represents for us is a heartbreaking delay in having this NTP finalized. The NTP has said that they're going to complete this they hope by the end of the year. Meanwhile, Philip Grandjean has written the ultimate review of fluoride. It's a very long paper, and if you're scientific or you know scientists, this is a terrific place to start because he's got chapter and verse for all the studies. Everything I've talked about is there in official language. The conclusions: for any community to continue fluoridation with all these studies, including several US government-funded studies and a draft NTP review on the table, is reckless, in my view. And the risks to fetal and infant brain development far outweigh any benefit to the teeth from ingestion of fluoride during fetal and infant development. In fact, there are very, very few dentists or dental organizations that even claim now that the fetus is getting any dental benefit from exposure. So it shouldn't be difficult to win that case. And other countries have shown that these benefits can be secured by other means. They've admitted that fluoride works topically. So if you want fluoride, you brush it on your teeth and spit out